Thank you so much. It's great to be here today, and I'd like to introduce my fantastic panel. Joining me today are Francesca Bria, who's the president of the Italian National Innovation Fund, Stefano Scarpetta, who's the Director of Employment, Labour and Social Affairs at the OECD, as well as Carla Pereira, who's a cabinet expert in the Cabinet of the European Commission for Jobs, Nicola Schmidt. Now, before we dive in, I'd like to remind you that please do ask questions. I'll be taking them throughout the panel. It's a great opportunity to pick the brains of our experts today. Well, I'll start the panel with a tricky question. And I want to know from all of you very briefly, what keeps you up at night? What do you think is the biggest challenge facing non-standard workers in Europe today? Why don't we start with Francesca?
Hi, everyone. So it's great to be here. So I think that obviously we've seen during the pandemic that more and more we see, as we saw also in the video, that algorithmic regulation, the use of data and artificial intelligence are profoundly changing the way that work is regulated, but also the business models of companies. However, we also see that more and more the work that is mediated by platforms and algorithms in the gig economy is increasingly making work relations more flexible, but also increasing the state of insecurity and losing safeguards and rights. And we saw that during the pandemic, this reached a peak, I would say, because we saw a multiplication in the use of gig workers. And so, for example, the number of riders during COVID has doubled in many European countries. And those changes, I would say, do not only affect riders, obviously, but also thousands of digital workers in a growing number of sectors that are still invisible. Think about freelancers, micro workers, and all these myriads of jobs, workers of digital platforms, where I would say if we do not act with bold policies, fragmented work risk to prevail with limited protection and with the risk of invasive form of control and surveillance. So what keeps me, let's say, up at night is that we need to guarantee dignity, protection, and rights to those workers with policies that need to address some of the key unresolved issues, I would say, such as definition of clear relationship and working conditions, access to welfare, of course, and social protection systems, access to collective bargaining and training policies, but also, and this is where my work has been very strong in the last years, transparency of algorithms and fair governance of workers' data. So we need to look very carefully at the dynamics of these new digital work organizations, try to anticipate their potential, but also act courageously to mitigate the unwanted effects that we see happening. And I think in the space of transparency, reliability, accountability of algorithms and artificial intelligence system, in defining working condition, it is crucial that to allow workers to be treated in compliance with the principle of labor law. So ensuring that a digital transition guided by values that will put people, solidarity, and digital rights first. And I think we can explore, I don't know if you want me to be brief now, but I think we should explore, in the framework of the new, for example, Data Governance Act and the new EU artificial intelligence regulation. How do we make sure that we ensure a fair governance of worker data that creates a solid foundation of transparency and trust between workers and companies, encouraging data trust agreements which are in compliance with privacy, security standards, and ethical use of data and artificial intelligence, and that ensure an equitable redistribution of the value that is produced by the data of citizens, workers, and businesses. So I think we need a new deal, a new social pact that include also a fair and accountable and transparent mechanism for a governance of data, artificial intelligence systems, and algorithms.
Great, thank you. I'd like to return to that later in the conversation, but now I want to hear from Anna. What do you think is the biggest challenge facing European workers today?
Hi, sorry for the small delay. I was in mute, so I had to unmute myself. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for Reshaping the work project to invite me for this very topical and important discussion. You have now reformulated the question, but your first question is what keeps us awake at night? And so because this is a personal question, I want to answer in a personal manner also. You know, I'm reaching 50, and I'm from a generation that still believe that if you do your part of the job, you will be somehow rewarded by life. If I work, I will get a decent salary, I will get a decent life. And I have a 12-year-old son, and I don't think the world will give him those answers anymore. So this is what keeps me at night thinking, what is the world of work my son and already many young people who are in the labor market are facing? Will they get some compensation even if they do their best? I think that is an important question, because what is the value that is behind our social contract, as Francesca was referring to, is at the essence of all these discussions. So this is, let's say, on a personal tone. On a more general tone and policy tone, I think there are two important elements in this discussion. First of all, and related to this idea of social contract, is to understand how some forms of work that we call non-standard forms of work are part of our solidarity contract, and how they have been further moved away from that contract, and how we have more and more an individualization of different risks. So this is an important trend that is certainly driven by globalization and technological developments, but also I would say is simply a matter of where the values lie, the social values lie. And I think the issue of what is the social protection for non-standard workers obviously covers the issue of platform work, because I think this is a central element in the discussion of this conference, but goes beyond that. When we are discussing whether a rider that does food delivery is protected or not, and we question whether this protection doesn't reach him because he's worker or self-employed, at the end of the day will be the same question we could ask: are currently pilots that run for Ryanair being protected or not? Because they're also being put at the strain of this individualization of the risk. And what we have seen through our work, so just to say that this work goes beyond platform work. Through the work of the Commission, what we have noticed is that there are two types of obstacles that non-standard workers face. First of one is certainly an impossibility to have access to social protection simply because the law doesn't allow for it. And in other circumstances, the law allows for it, but the conditions in which these access is provided is constructed in a way that doesn't allow people to have access to those. And what we do see is that most of the obstacles do relate to, for example, unemployment benefits, to sickness benefits, and to some extent to pensions, and very often the access to opt-in formulas for pensions and invalidity rights. So now I think what is interesting to understand is, and because we are having this conversation in a hopefully what can be almost a post-pandemic beginning, is to see that through the period of the pandemic and through the last 18 months, new solutions have been found by the countries to address some of these issues, to enlarge coverage, to allow for more social protection of different groups. Some countries have reduced or relaxed the criteria to have access to certain benefits. Some have increased the duration of the benefits. So at the end of the day, these are political choices. And through the crisis, we saw that those choices were made because there was an emergency and there was need to do so. Now, most of the measures that were taken were temporary, and they are perceived as temporary. And I think this is where this discussion is so timely, because maybe there is here a window of opportunity to make this, to raise a debate of why these temporary measures cannot be seen in a more structural way. Of course, in this entire debate, the status of the self-employed is probably the one that is most discussed right now, because the self-employed traditionally and still in most of the member states have little access to many social protection benefits that are state organized or mutualized. So obviously this is becoming a pressing question, because this is also a preferred way of working for many people, and is much more predominant in the economy than in the past. And because some people simply just don't have other opportunities and involuntarily are faced with self-employment. So having this discussion of where does the risk, who bears the cost of the risk, or who bears the risk, is an important question. For other categories of workers, we don't seem to have qualms about it, because there is mutualization, there is a solidarity way of looking into social protection. So there are state organized schemes. But because these new forms are emerging in the labor market, we seem to have doubts about it. So that is one first thing. The second big element, which Francesca really already mentioned quite a lot, is the introduction of artificial intelligence in the way we work. And this is obviously an intrinsic part of the way platform the work is conducted, because without the algorithm there is no platform. So it is intrinsically linked to the way platform work is organized, but goes beyond this. I mean, we should not see algorithm management just an issue related to platform, but it is broader. And of course, the introduction of artificial intelligence raise issues of moral issues, ethical issues, obviously, in relation to the introduction of a machine controlling the human being, but also raise issues related to labor rights. Can we uphold the labor rights and labor acquis, even if there is a machine entering in the world of work? And how can we ensure that the social standards that have been built over decades can remain there and are not, let's say, put at risk by the introduction of artificial intelligence? So that is also a very important question. And obviously, when we discuss the issue of platform, it is also at the heart of this notion of dependency and control, and who is whether platforms are employers or not, and how they exercise control over their collaborators. So it is very much linked with this question, which then obviously has an impact on the access to social protection, access to labor rights, and so forth. So these are for us two essential elements of the discussion.
Great, thank you, Anna. personally, what keeps me up at night is that I'll never retire. But I want to hear from Stefano now. What keeps you up at night? And sorry, Stefano, if you could keep your answer a few minutes so we can get going. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa, and a great question. I'll really try to be brief because I think a very important part of this is actually to get into a conversation also with those who are listening. Listen, maybe two things that keep me awake at night. One is the risk that we might actually miss the opportunity of walking the talk and actually take action on the issues that the pandemic has yet again revealed very, very clearly, I would say. And the second point is the tendency of the risk, at least, of using 20th century policy for 21st century issues. Let me elaborate maybe on these 2 points quickly. The first one is that I think the crisis has revealed once again the huge disproportion on the impact of this massive shock we had in our economies around the world on the already vulnerable. I mean, we're talking about young people, those with low skills, those in more precarious forms of employment, immigrants. It is true, and Carla referred to that maybe more than in previous crises, many countries put in place a lot of extraordinary measures in order to provide a backstop and provide some support also to these groups. Just to remind you that only in the OECD countries, so the most industrialized country, an independent worker has 40 to 50% less of a chance to receive any form of income support if he or she loses her activity, her job. And that was before the COVID crisis. So I think the crisis has revealed very clearly some of the gaps in our labor market policies, in our social protection policies, and so on and so forth. Now, the recovery, and we all hope, like Anna Carla was saying, that we are moving to the recovery from the COVID-19, actually has a big news because many countries are putting a lot of resources into the recovery plans. The question is to make sure that these resources also go to actually invest in closing these gaps on social protection, on the labor market policies that are otherwise, next crisis, we'll actually be seeing the same problem over and over. If you look at the youth unemployment, increased twice as much as the adult unemployment. If you look at about telework, the low skill were not able to telework, most of them. The high skill, actually more than 50% of them in the OECD countries were able to switch to telework. And they can go on and on. So I think the issues are clear, the diagnosis is clear, there's a lot of uncertainty going forward, but I think now we have to walk the talk and really try to address some of these issues that the crisis has revealed very clearly. The resources are there. The question is how to use them effectively. I just remind you that as we have made some estimates about how the digital transformation will change our labor market, and the evidence suggests that in the next 10 to 15 years, some 50% of the job will simply be automated, but another 30% will actually change dramatically. Many of the tasks today performed by workers could be performed by machine, by algorithm. So we're talking about 80 million jobs that will get into some sort of transformation. We really have to move from coping policies, or policies that respond to challenges, into preventive policies that help to some extent the workers to cope with these changes. There will be plenty of opportunity, there is no question about that. But I think there will also be challenges that we have to address. Now, quickly on the second point about not applying the 20th century policy to 21st century issues, many examples on that. For example, many countries are spending a lot of money, a lot of resources on training and retraining. This is absolutely essential, precisely because we need to skill and reskill many workers. Problem is that if you look at all OECD countries, the low skill receive much less training than the high skill, much less, a third to a quarter of what the high skill receive. So spending more is not a guarantee that we are going to spend well, and we are going to actually reach out to those who potentially need the training and retraining the most. The low skills, those who are in jobs that are unlikely to be automated or are likely to change significantly. Second, we refer to platform work. I've heard also in my own country issues about introducing a minimum wage, a hourly minimum wage for platform worker. Guess what? The second day, the day after this announcement was made, many of the platform workers were in the street protesting against that. We had to recognize the nature of this work and make sure we actually put in place the right policies in order to really address the challenges, but not try to turn something into something else. Another example I would like to give, if you look at really platform employment, is about 0.5% to 3% of total employment. It's still small, although increasing very rapidly. But if you look at the content of the work performed by what we call gig workers or platform workers, actually many of them perform what is more or less a normal job, a traditional job, simply mediated by a digital platform. So I think we have to actually classify labor relations properly, and you will discover that some of what we call platform workers are actually some form of dependent contractors. So there is an economic dependence with actually the company who actually manages their work. So proper classification of the labor relations, it's important because some of the protection that employees have could also be extended and should be extended to actually some of the platform workers. Again, Canada, for example, shift the burden of the proof of whether this is a dependent or independent relations from the worker, who has many difficulties in actually showing her case, to actually the company. So it's now the company that has to demonstrate that there is no economic dependence. So there are ways to address that. And I can go on, but I think there is a lot of way of thinking through smart way to put in place policies that face really the challenges. And let me conclude with one thing, which is keeping me awake at night, and this is artificial intelligence. If you look at the speed of penetration of artificial intelligence in our economies, is actually impressive. Artificial intelligence today is used by many large companies in the selection of personnel. It is already used to monitor performance of many workers, and so on and so forth. So when we think about how to regulate to actually get the best out of artificial intelligence, but actually prevent some of the bad things from happening, for biases in the use of artificial intelligence and so on and so forth, we have to recognize that this is a technology that is evolving very rapidly. And the traditional way of discussing new policies, new regulation, going to the democratic process, going to parliament, becoming new laws, might actually be inconsistent with the speed of change artificial intelligence is bringing about. So we have to think, and I'm afraid I don't have the answer on how to, about smart regulation. So in other words, regulation can to some extent already anticipate some of the changes and be, when they are passed through democratic processes, are still relevant for the issues that at that time they would have to some extent to govern. So it's a different way to set up policies, to set up regulations that take into account that some of these technologies are evolving very rapidly and the issue change very quickly. For the time being, some of the regulation are actually self-made by the private sector itself. There are a number of companies now certifying the unbiasedness of algorithms, but these are done by the private sector. There is not much role for the public sector. And I wonder how much trust we can give in this kind of certification. I can stop here, but this is, of course, one of the many issues that I think would be good to discuss with all of you.
Thank you, Stefano. To pick up on your last point there, I want to ask Anna. Now, the European Commission has recently presented the world's first AI law, which will introduce certain requirements for companies providing high-risk AI, meaning AI that will potentially harm people the most. And labor is one high-risk area. But these criteria, such as human oversight, companies have to do self-assessments to meet this criteria. And this has been something that's been criticized by labor unions and labor law academics, and potentially Stefano, based on what he just said. Now, Anna, why did the Commission end up doing this? And how do you intend to walk the walk when it comes to introducing regulation that is future-proof?
Yes, it's a very sensitive question. I would say the story is not over. Of course, we have the Artificial Intelligence Act that has been proposed by the Commission and is now being discussed with the co-legislators. And fundamentally, what the Act is trying to address is the production and design of artificial intelligence and provide some safety in this respect, in respect to fundamental rights, for example, discrimination, and have some elements of redress. Now, I think what is important to acknowledge is that the Commission proposal looks at the issue from a producer and user perspective. Producer, those that produce the artificial intelligence and the algorithms, and those that use them. Now, in the context of labor markets, the workers, and here let's use workers not in a legal way, so all those at work, let's put it this way, will be exposed to that technology and will be confronted with new working methods that are, let's say, different and new, because they have an element of our artificial intelligence. Sometimes the work will come to them simply through the algorithm, and you don't have a human face behind it anymore. So there is an issue of accountability, and of course there is an issue of asking, if I don't agree with the decision taken by the algorithm, what do I do as a worker? To whom do I call? Who is accountable for this? And can I have access to my data? And could I, together with my colleagues, have a collective action in relation to those actions? So these are all legitimate questions. And of course, it is in this context that the Commission has put also forward some questions around these topics in the second stage consultation to social partners on platform work, because we do acknowledge that there might be scope to provide an additional element in relation to algorithm management that comes from a labor market perspective, a labor law or labor rights perspective. But of course, in doing so, we need to see what is the value added of such additions, what would be the things that are not covered by, or would potentially not be covered by the Act, and how this would be specific to the labor market context. So this is, I would say, a story to be continued in different chapters.
Thank you. Now, Francesca, what do you think of these initiatives? Is there something, that you really see lacking that Europe really needs to get a grip on?
Yeah, I think building on also what Stefano was saying, and the question of are democratic processes fit for purpose in the digital age? I would strongly argue for a yes. I don't think the problem here is democratic processes. I think the problem is a lack of democratic processes when it comes to regulating and anticipating the changes that the digital world is bringing to us. So to be more specific, I think to date, the predominant model of data governance is not defined by a framework that guides action for the public interest, but is defined mainly by big tech, which extracts the value from large-scale collection of personal data in exchange for so-called free digital services. Similarly, I think the use of big data and machine learning in workplaces is changing the execution, as it was said by Anna and Stefano, of a certain task and the organization of work. So this is raising a number of critical issues when it comes to respect the role of algorithms, for example, and personal data. So I think it is really needed to define the tools and objectives to build trust in how data is collected, processed, used, and exploited. And it is also necessary to encourage the sharing of data of public interest while guaranteeing algorithmic responsibility, because we know that we need this data for competitiveness, to tackle environmental and social problems, and to progress with our economy. So data governance goes beyond, I think, what we mean as a concept of good management. So we need norms and rules that will have to be established to redefine also models of data ownership, as Anna was saying, who is in control, and extraction of value, who can profit from the value that this data is producing, considering data and artificial intelligence, for instance, as digital public good, and ensuring an effective protection of citizens and workers. So I think that the principle and rules for the use of this data for commercial, for example, and business purposes by third parties of also platform data must be defined, and we can have specific safeguards in the relationship between companies and workers. For example, when it comes to the use of AI in the selection and management of personnel that we see happening more and more. For example, I just shared an experience in Italy. We have been constructing now a multidisciplinary group of experts set up at the Ministry of Labour and Social Policies, which is collaborating with the European Commission and with other member states on this topic, that analyze how the transformation of data-intensive business model and algorithms is affecting the labour market, with the aim to protect individuals as generator of data, as workers and as citizens. So I think the goal should be to involve social parties in order to identify clear principle, rules and standards for a democratic governance of data and algorithms. Because for me, producing a fair, transparent and inclusive regulation of data and algorithms means proposing a new vision of labor law and democratic algorithmic control in the era of digital platforms, which, I mean, as Carla and Stefano are saying, it's not just riders and the digital platforms, it's becoming more and more, it's including more and more sectors of the economy that we thought and we describe as traditional sectors of the economy, which have been transformed by the use of automation, artificial intelligence, and algorithms. So just to conclude, I think ensuring a just, inclusive, and sustainable functioning of the digital labor market will need to promote a conscious governance of platforms, data, and algorithms for the public interest, for the common good. So we should not say this is impossible, because at the moment, these things are regulated only in the interest, unfortunately, of few players.
Thank you. Now, Stefano, as I'm sure you know, some Uber drivers have used this data argument to, collect data of themselves to prove that they are in fact workers, and that kind of raises the question of worker classification. Where do you stand on that? Do you think classifying gig workers as employees is smart? Has it worked? What evidence have you seen, in your studies?
No, thank you, Melissa. This is a key issue. And what I would suggest for our discussion here is that I think it's also useful to distinguish different type of gig workers or platform workers. You were referring to Uber drivers, and which is one of the different type of categories. They have one characteristic in common, in my view. They actually perform a certain task in a given location. So they're physically located in a particular area, city, whatever. Then you have maybe another category of gig workers or platform workers. They are really digital workers. They actually provide services to clients around the world. They don't have any geographical constraint in their activity, right? They actually enjoy dramatically the fact that they work for a platform because they have clients around the world. And we have many examples of that. Those who develop a new software, those who actually provide digital services to many clients around the world. So I think it's difficult to bring together all the platform or gig workers into one category because the nature of the work is very different. So a Uber driver is basically a taxi driver. The only difference compared to a standard taxi driver is actually that the intermediation between the client and the driver is the Uber or the platform company. And this, I think, where the classification comes into play, because could be considered very well a dependent contractor. And in fact, in many countries, as you know, there are discussions about considering them to some extent dependent, at least from an economic point of view, and extending some of the protection which is generally provided to the employees. Having said that, there will be a group of platform gig workers who are really sort of in between an employee and an independent worker. And they actually like that. They don't want to be turned into an employee working for one single company all the time. And they also need some form of protection. That's what we call in the OECD the gray zone, in which some adaptation of policy is needed in order to give them a minimum social protection, a minimum guarantee, also certain working condition and so on. That's not easy to put in practice, but I think it's a challenge that we are facing. So I think a lot should be done in properly classifying the labor relations between the worker and the company. And then basically the size of the gig worker would be diminishing. And the other one, thinking about how to extend some basic element of policies to actually give them support. And again, we cannot ask the worker to demonstrate their case because most of the time they are in a pretty weak position. The example I was giving before about Canada, because actually with a simple change in law, they've turned the burden of the proof on the employer. And that's a big change because then it's the employer who has to prove that there is no economic dependency of the workers with whom they're working. So I think this distinction, in my view, it's important in order to start focusing on what policy are needed. But let me also say, building on what was said before, is that when we look at the lack of coverage, we are not just looking at platform workers. We are talking about sometimes a third of the workforce that either are self-employed, independent workers, or are in some form of short-term contract, and they get much less protection than the standard full-time open-ended contract, workers on full-time open-ended contracts. So we're talking about a significant size of the workforce that today in the most advanced economies actually has a pretty low level of actual protection. They might be entitled to unemployment benefits, sick leave, and so on, but de facto, given the low contribution they might be paying, they actually receive very little. So we have to actually think about how to extend and improve access to social protection, access to some labor market policy to all workers who are in non-standard form of employment. It's not just the gig worker. The gig worker is maybe one element of that, the tip of the iceberg, but below that, there are actually many other workers who are in a pretty precarious position. And again, the pandemic has simply revealed how precarious this position was.
Great, thank you. Now, I want to take a question from the audience, and this is for Anna from Lucas Pilgrim. He's asking, will the European Commission in its upcoming initiative address the issue you mentioned that the legal systems in member states often prevent self-employed workers to access the social protection systems, of course, keeping the competences in mind? And I'd also like to add, concretely, what I've heard that the Commission is working on a directive to improve the working conditions of platform workers at the end of this year. What can you share with us?
Yes, so what can I share with you? Well, I don't think it is a secret to anyone that all these questions related to the employment status, the risk of misclassification are part of our work. They have been clearly identified as one key determinant to ensure access to labor rights and social protection for platform workers. And of course, this is, as you can imagine, a very sensitive issue, but a difficult one, but one that we need to address, with courage. If we just take all the legal cases in courts throughout Europe, we just by the sheer number of the open cases that are being discussed and those that have been closed, this is by itself a justification for us to look at it, because fundamentally we are talking about giving the possibility or giving the thought that the future development of platforms is one that is sustainable and is bringing social rights with it. That's, I think, our aim is that as platform work evolves, it also evolves in a sustainable, socially sustainable manner. Now, in the consultation that we are currently conducting with social partners, the consultation closes in 4 days. We will soon have the positions of the different parties. In that consultation, we clearly put as a possibility for further action to propose at European level what we call a rebuttable presumption of an employment relationship. So in a way, this idea of reversing the burden of proof is intrinsic to that. So you are basically saying from the beginning, we presume an employment relationship, and if there is a need to show otherwise, then it will be for the employer to ask for that work to be done, but we also need to acknowledge that such an approach might not cater for situations where there is a true non-dependency relationship. So this is some of the issues that we are dealing with. In this respect, I would like to slightly disagree with Stefano has said, if you allow me, Stefano, because I don't think the geographical dimension really matters in this conversation. It is really about the control between the platform and the person that works for the platform, and whether that person does have all the leeway and independency. And this question is as valid on an on-location type of activity as is on an online type of activity. It depends on the level of control that is exercised by the platform on the performing of the activity, on the conditions on which this activity is performed. So I would like just to bring some variant of disagreement so that we also spice a little bit our exchange. But obviously this notion of dependency and as contrarium control, whether the person is in full control of its situation or is under the control of the platform, is one that is essential in our work and can be legislated in a binding manner.
Great, thank you. Now, I have graciously been granted 9 more minutes in this panel. So I would like to ask, you all have 1 or 2 minutes max. I want to, what's on your to-do? What should companies and workers do to improve the situation? What can they do? So very briefly, your top tips for companies and workers. Francesca, please.
I leave Stefano. Stefano, go first.
Okay, Stefano.
Well, I mean, what they have to do in 2 minutes, they have to talk to each other. I think we really have to strengthen effective, good social dialogue. I think, happy to disagree with you, Anna Carla, we can have other chances to discuss and explain better what I mean. But the point here is that, again, we have to use a 21st century way of communication, dialogue, and the collective bargaining. And actually the unions on their side have done a lot to adapt their policies. I mean, only a few years ago, many unions in our OECD countries were actually trying to, how can I say, maybe prevent the control to some extent, the development of platform work and gig worker. Now, actually, a number of unions have created, spin-offs that actually focus specifically on the needs of gig workers. I think really we need to have more social dialogue to actually address some of the specific challenges of the evolving economy and this part of the economy, which is likely to increase. There is no question about it. But I think, again, try to understand well what are the issues and what are the wishes of the workers we're talking about, and not pretending that we know by applying sort of traditional views of, for example, what the employees need, but take into account some of the characteristics which are unique, I would say, of some of the platform gig workers, digital workers. I think there is a big agenda for government. There is no question. I fully agree with what Francesca said before. We need more democratic process. There is no question about it. We need more regulation that actually are, again, forward-looking. But also, I think government by themselves will not be enough. Where it is about the data, where it is about even power to some extent, we are now dealing with many large multinationals that have a huge role. They're much bigger than many of our countries in the OECD in terms of size of their, if you like, revenue compared to GDP. So we need really to engage in more fruitful, effective dialogue and discussion, government on their end, but also the social partner. And I think we need to understand better what are some of the specific features of these new forms of employment in order to actually regulate or actually improve the working condition, the pay of this. I remind you that for platform work, if they are considered to be independent workers, they cannot negotiate wages and working conditions because this is against competition law. So again, we're not saying to change competition law by no means, it's too complicated, but the way in which competition law are interpreted is something which should be part of the discussion as well.
Thank you. Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, Francesca, do you want to go?
Yeah, sure. So I think mainly a couple of short points. First of all, I think now, in particular in Europe, with the resilience and recovery facility and the national recovery plans, we have to make sure that this question of empowering workers and social cohesion and really reskilling, retraining, giving power to people and to workers is at the core of what we are doing, because we have to make sure that the two big transitions that we are facing, on one side, the digital transition to make it more democratic, more equal, and to empower our economy, and the ecological transition, are not going to leave behind the most vulnerable population, or even what we are calling gig workers or autonomous workers or precarious workers, which, as Stefano has said, is like, actually we're talking about 1/3 of the working population. So it's huge. And it's, if you go to see, then we have a big question with women unemployment. We have a big question with young people and how they are now facing this big transformation. So I think empowering this agenda, strengthening the question of empowering workers and creating new type of frameworks that enable us to tackle these challenges, I think is absolutely central. So we won't be able to make Europe greener and more digital if we don't put labor at the center. And then finally, I think we do have a real question of as Stefano said, there is a big task for government. I think there is also a big task for unions and for companies. And I think many times when I work in this space, I see there is a lack of capacity. There is almost a lack of understanding of certain issues. Definitely when you talk to sometimes to trade unions, and definitely when you talk to small companies, and when you talk to people in government. So when I was talking about this multidisciplinary group, we do deal with competition policy, we deal with industrial policy, we have experts on data security, we have experts on legal experts on labor laws and labor standards. We look at platforms in a broader way. We even have ethical experts about accountability and so on. These are now issues that you need to tailor at the core of how you're facing labor transformation. So if these competencies are not around, you cannot deal with the issues. So maybe this is about what we intend for smart regulation. Smart regulation means that you regulate it, tackling the real challenges and on time. And we cannot get there if we do not build the right capacity and competencies that we need. And so we also have to face this kind of organizational change to get there.
Thank you so much. Now, Anna, we have a few more minutes. So your tips for companies and workers, please.
I think, well, my wish for companies, and certainly also for platform companies, is to consider basing their business models on a higher productivity activities, and obviously also invest in training and skills, but also consider that a sustainable business is one that tries to pitch higher in the productivity ladder, and so I don't think because sooner or later many of the jobs will be replaced by machines, that there is a lot of future in business models that do base solely on very low productivity work. So that is one message I would pass to companies. For workers, I would say, well, I think beyond the element of seeking a collective voice, because that's an important way in being able to have leverage and in being able to negotiate. I would say that workers should also be exigent in the human element of the introduction of technology in the workplace. It's not here about being eluded or anything like this, but it is ensuring that there is at the core of this digital transformation, there are human values, there is this respect of fundamental rights. And for those that have not yet the curiosity or the chance, I would suggest to read this little book called I, Robot, from this gentleman called Asimov. So it's from the 50s, but is an extraordinary piece of science fiction where he also puts the philosophical question of the relationship between the man and the machine. And yeah, so that is maybe for the weekend. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I'd like to thank all our panelists for this really interesting conversation. I think we have a break now, and I'll hand it over to Giovanna. Thank you so much.